Our moderator for today is Ben Elder. Ben is the chair of the IVSC's Tangible Asset Standards Board and head of valuation for the RICS, where he leads the development and global adoption of their Red Book valuation standards. So with that, Ben, thank you very much. And now over to you.
Thank you, Richard. Hi, everybody. I hope you're all well. Good morning, good evening, good night, wherever you are in the world. So great to have you along for this really interesting webinar that we're going to enter in. We're going to look at the survey that IVSC have been carrying out in this space around ESG and the importance of ESG. And I'm going to pass it over to Alex for a few moments to run us through the key findings before I move on to the subject experts with Richard, Becky and Rahul. So over to you, Alex.
Thank you all very much. So just starting off with the IVSC ESG survey highlights. We did 3 separate surveys, one for businesses, one for valuation providers, and one for investors. And the survey closed on the 30th of April 2022. Starting off looking at the results of the surveys from firms, you can see that most firms were in the early stages of ESG identification. You can see that 38% responded that way, 29% had partially identified ESG. So looking at a total where about 67% who are in the early stages of ESG identification. In terms of the results from the firms, there is no consistent framework or standards used by firms, investors, or valuation providers. And one of the concerns with this is this could lead to a lack of transparency and consistency, and it very much illustrates the need to have a globally consistent approach when dealing with ESG. Having a look at the key roles to be played in terms of ESGs, from the firm's responses that we've received, we would expect about 30% customers, 23% investors, but regulators very much have a key role to shape in terms of shaping ESG policies, and you can see that from the survey results that are shown here. Moving forward, we asked firms whether they were able to quantitatively estimate the financial impacts of any ESG factors as part of their business or budgeting forecast. And you can see here, 54% said they couldn't do this at all. This highlights the work that's currently being undertaken by the new International Standards Sustainability Board and how important their work is to make sure that the financial impacts of any ESG factors can be shown within business budgeting or forecasting. Moving forward from that, asking over what time period do you believe that social factors affect the timing of your risk for future cash flows. What was extremely interesting in this is that most firms saw social factors as being in the medium term, which is 12 to 36 months. But when they were asked the same question with environmental and governance factors, they came through with a result that was very much more long term. Just moving forward from there and looking at the results at valuation providers, once again, we asked valuation providers whether there was a consistent framework that they used for ESG when measuring, assessing, monitoring, analysing or reporting ESG considerations. And what you can see is, once again, we've got quite a mix here. In fact, it's quite worrying that the response that got the most results was actually none, that no framework was actually being used. After that, it was UN Sustainable Development Goals, Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, United Nations Principle for Responsible Investment and Global Reporting Initiative, with others coming in at about 8% and 4%. So it really does highlight the need for a framework. When we look at ESG factors and we say to what extent are you considering them within your valuation reports, for the most part, people pick the options at the lower end of the scale, with one being not at all and two being hardly at all. Moving forward from there, when we ask to what extent is the current state of information and public company general purpose financial statements in your jurisdiction sufficient for you to adequately address the impacts of ESG factors on valuation conclusions, the majority felt that it was insufficient. This reflected the response of the firms as well, and hopefully this situation will change as the important work is undertaken by the International Standards Sustainability Board, who will be looking to have more specific requirements in relation to ESG and financial reporting. We also asked valuation providers, what source of ESG information have you used in your valuation? The majority said the information came from discussion with management, followed by industry reports, corporate sustainability reports, and lower down is ESG ratings. And this might highlight the inconsistency in ESG ratings that has also been highlighted in one of the previous perspective papers on this subject issued by the IVSC. We also asked, what is your view on how the international valuation standards currently deal with ESGs? And the majority felt that we need to be more explicit in our standards around ESG considerations. Well, this will be coming in the next edition of IVS, which will be published in 2024. The perspective papers are often a precursor to standard setting, and we're looking for more explicit requirements. Now, in terms of investors, I put the investors last because, to be honest, our sample size we don't believe was sufficient to give that much attention to the results that we received from investors, but we will be looking at further outreach to investors in future. And when we asked how much of a priority is it for your firm that companies in which you are invested in or are planning to invest mandate ESG considerations into their business plans and operational frameworks, it was pretty much split across the range, as you can see. And moving forward from that, we also said, asked in which jurisdictions have you begun to see as regarding the most useful ESG information that's being mandated. And to be honest, the results were pretty much like the attendance actually for this panel discussion, with the majority coming from Europe, 58%, 17% from the Americas. And we see this as very much reflecting where regulation and requirements are within these markets at the moment. So we're moving, our next step, we are going to be publishing this survey on an annual basis so we can monitor the progress made by firms, investors and valuation providers in relation to the consideration of ESG and ESG components within the valuation process. We will continue to issue ESG-related perspective papers during 2022 to further explore the consideration of ESGs and its components within the valuation process, and to act as a precursor to more explicit ESG requirements in the next edition of IVS. We are also planning to publish a perspective paper containing the full results of this survey in July. So that will be published shortly. So Ben, if I can hand back to you and the panel now. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. That's a great run through and a really rich set of data which IVSC is starting to collect in this space. I'm going to move swiftly on to the panel now and get their immediate thoughts and whether they recognise those sentiments in the survey there, and perhaps each panelist would say a few words about their focus of work, where they're coming from when they start to look at this information. So, Raoul, let's start with you. Do you recognise those views and those opinions?
Thank you, Ben. First off, thank you for having me. It's great to be on the panel. Short answer is yes. But real quickly, to give folks context of where I'm coming from, I'm a managing director with Kroll in the Alternative Advisory Group. We routinely help LP, GP clients with private equity, private credit valuations. I also extensively collaborate on our ESG advisory initiatives within Kroll, and there's a lot that we are doing there. So again, please look us up if you're any questions on valuation or diligence. But really, Ben, on this, it is amazing how many of these resonate. I guess my quick reaction would be, if I did this survey 2 years ago, I would likely I have seen many similar themes. So, which leads me to believe, albeit we are doing a lot to move the ball forward with ISSP and IVSC and SEC coming up with disclosure rules, it is a space in a flux. There is a lot that is evolving. And so the fact that there is no standardized framework yet, I think is a fact. But we've come a long way. And so I'm trying to see the half glass full here. I guess the other thing that was interesting for me was the focus on social. That is true. It comes up in my conversations as well. I feel maybe E and G are a little better defined, and social continues to be defined. And lastly, I'll just react to the response on ESG factors not considered in valuation. I wonder if there's a little bit more context that folks may have been able to provide, which is, in the past, before the ESG acronym was coined, we did think about these factors, right? Whenever there was an environment or cultural issues within companies, at least I did, we significantly reflected on valuation and even moved valuations. So, but it's interesting that as we are focusing more on this acronym and getting more granular, I appreciate the fact that, yes, those granular details are not easily available, and folks are scrambling to see how to think about correlations with valuation. So I'll stop there, but yes, they all resonate.
That's great, Rahul. Thanks very much. Richard, over to you. Your thoughts and whether you recognise the snapshots.
Thanks, Ben. I do. I was having two thoughts as we were running through those results. One is a little bit like what Rahul said. I've been practicing business and tangible asset valuation for about 30-something years in PwC, and 20-some of those as a partner, based mainly in Australia and doing work across the Asia-Pacific region. As won't be a surprise to those who know the Australian economy, there's quite a large mining sector here. So one of my industry expertise is in fact the mining game, which is something which I'm sure we'll return to during this session. But the thing that Rahul said that really echoed with me is, in valuations at one level, we've been looking at political, environmental, social and technological factors and how they impact cash flows for a very long time. What we're struggling with, I think, is the urgency of the agenda around ESG and how the information requirements are changing so rapidly. And I think what we're seeing from that is I think four things. Everyone's at an early stage of considering the new information. It's very difficult to estimate how that's going to impact cash flow, not only for investors, but also for the companies that prepare the forecast themselves. So that's going to be ultimately a problem for investors as well. Valuation is a relative art and a comparable art. And the consistency and comparability of data is a crucial issue we need to get right, because if one person says it and no one else says it, it's just marketing as opposed to something that can be used in evaluation. And then finally, I think the role of regulators and standard setters is something that's key to helping valuers get a better grasp on this.
Thanks, Richard. That's, again, really helpful. And last but not least, Becky, your thoughts.
Thanks, Ben. I think compared to Rahul and Richard, I'm kind of coming at this from a tangible asset valuation point of view. So I head up quality and risk management at CBRE for their European valuation team. Most of our valuation work obviously relates to real property, rather than entity valuation, which I know Rahul and I have had a sort of discussion about this before. And I think I agree with everything that both Richard and Rahul have said. I've got a note here that the key points that I'd kind of pulled out from those findings, and it's everything that they've kind of already kind of highlighted: consistency, the data, regulation, is a huge kind of factor in all of this, and sort of waiting to see what happens with regulation across all the different countries. But from my point of view, actually, one of the most interesting feedbacks was from the firms when Alex was saying that they almost sort of had quite a positive response to their activities around the social and the governance piece, and less on the environmental. Whereas I think for tangible assets, it's completely the other way around. I think when you're looking at an asset, trying to get your head around those social and governance issues is so much more difficult and it's very different to if you're looking at a company. So I found that very interesting. And I also think a key point that Alex kind of touched on at the end is that they're going to continue with this survey annually. And I think that's so important because this is just changing. This is a moving feast. It's changing all the time. So it'll be really interesting to see how those kind of results change over time as well.
Thanks, Becky. Again, great comments. And just a reminder to the audience, if you've got any questions for the panel, please pop them in the Q&A session, and we'll try and pick them up. And if we don't get to them today, we'll make sure that we respond in an appropriate format to you. Richard already picked up the urgency issue on this on the ESG agenda. But I attended a seminar recently, and one of the presentations gave an actual weather forecast for July 2050 for the UK, and it talked about being at 40 degrees centigrade, so 100 degrees plus Fahrenheit, for a period of 4 weeks prior, and that this very hot weather would be broken by violent storms following next week, where flooding would be prevalent across the UK. These were proper weather forecasts from the modelling. Obviously, this has significant impact on the way we're going to live. Just running around the panel, do you think that actually the valuation profession, understands the urgency of the situation, and any thoughts how we might address that urgency? Perhaps start with Richard, because he already raised the issue, so only fair to play the ball back into his court.
Yeah, I was reflecting as you said that weather forecast sounds like a Sydney summer, to be honest. But we have experienced that now. We have very hot days followed by floods, as we've had the last 2 summers, quite considerable floods, following a bushfire season, which was the back of a really big drought. So this is real and present for us in this country already. The interesting is the role of the valuation profession in that, though, because I think the valuation profession is largely a mirror of the markets within which investors operate. So we are mostly tasked with estimating what that market would come up with as a value estimate between willing and not under pressure counterparties. So it's difficult for us to take the lead. We need to reflect the circumstances of the markets in which we operate. And we see in some markets, for example, in carbon intensive mining and oil and gas, we've already seen substantial shifts of investor appetite in those markets. But that's been limited to those markets where we see a really profound implication there. In other markets, it's very nuanced. So for valuers to go out on a limb in those markets where market transactions haven't really been informed to a large extent by those considerations is, I think, going to be difficult for people to sustain under the current way in which we perform valuations.
Thanks, Richard. Becky, to you.
I think this is a tough one. Again, I agree with Richard. My opening gambit whenever I talk about this subject, and I'm talking to valuers about this subject, is, the mantra of we reflect the market, we don't lead the market. But I appreciate the comment there, are we hiding behind that? I think what's difficult with ESG and sustainability is that in the definitions of sort of fair value, market value, we're assuming that all market participants, all market actors have a certain level of knowledge. And I think with ESG and sustainability, the problem is that not everybody has that knowledge in the market. So can we trust the market almost? And I think it's as valuers, we're naturally skeptical about some of the information that's provided. But I've seen sort of similar forecasts given around sort of climate, weather conditions. And from my point of view, it would be good from the sort of the regional Met offices or wherever it comes from to almost have some sort of report on weather. Aside from just looking at flooding, just looking at fire risk and these things, I think actual kind of storms and sort of this kind of forecasting could be really valuable information. And it's probably just another pool of information that would be really useful for valuers to have. But I think at the moment we sometimes approach these things with an element of skepticism because that's what we're kind of told to do almost, we're sort of digging into the detail.
Thanks, Becky. Rahul, and I think this sort of plays back into some of the work that you've been doing with many firms over a number of years, right, looking at particularly transitional risk, etc. So perhaps your comments.
For sure, and 100% agree with Becky and Richard there. I guess a couple of things that I may add is, again, what you were talking about, Ben, is the E of ESG. It's the climate. And again, we club these themes together, but they're different, and they have each has a different is on a different path in terms of our understanding and investors' understanding. I think E folks can wrap their heads around more easily. S and G will maybe G too. S is in my mind the hardest, like I said earlier. What I encourage folks to do, though, and again, this is what I have benefit from in my past life, sort of working with CEOs, CFOs, talking about valuations and how they're running businesses, is to at least have the conversation. The frameworks are coming, but the fact that E, S, and G, each of these components, and is something to pay more attention to today versus 5-6 years ago is now known. And so through dialogue and through diligence, one could have the conversation around climate impact on companies, and the other way around too, how the companies are impacting the climate. And similarly around certain themes around S and G, to expedite and draw reactions from investors and attempt to price it, incorporate it into valuation analyses. And so I think there is a sense of urgency, Ben, going back to your question, but I feel we can be more proactive and expedite that whilst we are still waiting on standards and the regulators to give us a framework.
Thanks, Rahul. Yeah, again, really insightful comments. I've got a follow-up question, but we need to go to a polling question first. But just before the polling question comes up, just to give this some thought, if we're moving, is there a danger that we're moving away from a mark-to-market model to a mark-to-model model when we start to have these other information sources pushed in on us by clients or other parties? Perhaps have a think about that, and I'll come to Becky first on that, but Richard's got another polling question for us. So, to what extent are ESG considerations integrated into your work? Fully integrated, mostly integrated, starting to become, not yet, or not likely to become? Yeah, fully integrated, 2% of the audience, mostly integrated, 8%, starting to become integrated, 39%, not yet integrated, the vast majority at 48%, and not likely to is 3%. So a small percentage saying that it's not going to happen. I guess most of the people sitting there saying yes, they might want to. Becky, Richard's got his hand up because he obviously needs to jump in on something very urgent. Then we'll come back to you. So, Richard.
Sorry, I was just avoiding the statement of 2020 by clicking myself off mute before I started talking. I was just intrigued by one of the questions that was raised around ESG scores and the marking to model question you raised earlier. And what ESG scores do for me is effectively trying to come up with a shadow price mechanism, which is effectively a model which is not necessarily as transparent as it could be. And I think that ESG is very subtle in its impacts for each different company. So you need to understand the exposure and the management of that exposure for each individual company. And a score takes all that away, that agency away from you, and tries to compound it into a single measure. And I think that way oversimplifies things. And I think that's where Demoter in particular is coming from in terms of his critique of things. So I think disclosure of what you do and how you manage that, what you do, is really important. But actually the compression of that into a score, I find not so satisfying. And that's akin to the dialogue around the mark to model. Someone else has come up with that model, and they say, well, we should mark to it. But unfortunately, there's no consistency in that marking. So it's very difficult to apply that in your valuation analysis.
Thanks, Richard. That's, again, really helpful. Becky, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Richard, as well. I completely agree. I think The trouble with ESG and valuation is that people almost think it's like a set of criteria that we need to map against, when it's more a lens that we need to look through things slightly differently through. That's the way we've sort of discussed it before at CBRE. And I think there is a danger of going to modelling rather than following the market. And at the end of the day, we have to stay close to the market. That is our job. And I think, again, Richard raised the point about the perceptions around ESG. If I was doing a valuation of a property for a lender, they might see poor energy efficiency as obviously a negative, as a risk that they're taking on. If I was doing the same valuation for an investor or somebody that was an asset manager, they might see that as an advantage and somewhere they can add value. So it's very, very difficult to fix a model and fix marks and numbers to these things. It's really, really hard.
Some real challenges there, Becky. Rahul, from your perspective.
Real quickly, I agree. I actually understood your question, Ben, to be more around if there are these climate models available, how do you sort of incorporate them? And so my early thoughts were there could be room to incorporate the models, and of course all the warnings Richard put out there. I fully agree with the chaos around ratings and how folks are attempting to oversimplify. But I'm imagining a world where these models may coexist, similar to how you have the BAS diffusion model for technology adoption, or even the well decline models when you sort of are valuing an upstream energy company. So I'm imagining a world where these models, once informed and appropriately used, can help inform how certain inputs within the framework of your enterprise valuation are trending over time. Maybe it helps inform growth of the company. Maybe it helps inform the risk profile over time. And then you marry all of that with what is getting priced in and marked to market. Again, we'll see more. There's actually some interesting work getting done in Kroll in that direction, and these are very early days, but we are hopeful there could be a future where we could leverage the great work being done to predict how things are going to trend and marry it with the analysis that we're doing.
Thanks, Rahul. It sort of brings thoughts to my mind around the challenges or perhaps the opportunities to look at whether we ought to be reporting market value and investment value with ESG criteria set against it for reporting purposes, and whether that would be a productive way forward to try and meet some of the challenges, so that we become absolutely clear what's the valuation and what's the advice part. Becky, sorry to jump on you, but there's a question directed at you, and not a nasty question, it's a great question. How do ESG factors affect a real estate valuation at the valuation date? For example, can a valuer quantify these factors? So very practical issue and of the data valuation, because again, we tend to look forward rather than backwards, sideways, whatever the process is. So have you got any thoughts on that, Becky?
It's the $1 million question, isn't it? If I can answer that, I've answered everything. That's it. Again, the data valuation is key always. That is the date that we're all working to, and at the end of the day, that's the date that we're kind of working back to. I think in terms of actually factoring in the impacts on value, all that valuers can do under thinking about the Red Book, thinking about the IVS, is following the market. If the market evidence is showing that there is an addition in value because of ESG factors or however it may be, then obviously that would just naturally come through into the value that we would be reporting. I think the difficulty for us is hiving out those ESG issues, because particularly when you're talking about tangible assets like property, a prime asset will come with a premium anyway. So how much of that premium is down to the green parts of the premium, and how much of it is just down to the fact that it's a great building and it's been designed in this way? And I think one of the great advantages or the great kind of progressions with ESG over the last sort of 12 to 18 months is that this has almost been factored into new development. It is just something that we expect to be in there. It's not really an extra anymore. So again, as valuers, it makes it very difficult for us to individually pick out ESG factors. But what we need to be doing is flagging, and from my point of view, where I'm giving advice to valuers, I need to be making sure that they're considering all of these different aspects of the market. Think about the positives. We can look at the negatives. We can look at potential cost impacts and potentially take that off a number. We can look at not poor energy performance and maybe make some discounts there. But it's about thinking about those positives as well. But it's very, very difficult to monetize that at the moment. I would say it's very, well, from a tangible assets point of view anyway. It may be different for entity valuation.
Thanks, Becky. That nicely leads us on to the next area for questioning. So a good link up there. Most of the regulations that appear to be emanating from IFRS and other bodies, etc., tend to look at the entity level rather than the actual individual asset, and yet a lot of the performance or the energy performance of the asset is generated at that base level, as Becky was just indicating. Do you think that's a challenge, and is it a simple addition process that leads to the entity value, or is it something much more complex than that? And again, perhaps start with Rahul on that one, if I may.
100% happy to chime in, but really looking forward to Becky's thoughts on this one. Again, a lot of what we do is at the enterprise level. And I think there's some good early ideas on frameworks and how to incorporate ESG. My hope is when you sort of start looking at the tangible assets specifically, there may be pointers and guidelines in these frameworks that you could still potentially apply. Like I said, I think going back to, yes, even if a framework is not available, you now know what all stakeholders, actually, I would underscore that it's not just the investors, it's your customers, it's your employees these days. You know what all stakeholders are caring about. So whether it's a business or maybe it's a tangible asset, you could incorporate those same themes as you sort of think about growth risk for companies and thereby valuation.
Richard, thoughts particularly from a BV perspective? I guess it depends on the type of business and what assets and what activities they're involved with.
Exactly right. So the complexity of a business is clearly composed of a bunch of other assets operating within a system, operated by people, and some of the components of ESG apply almost entirely to the people that operate the business. So governance, for example, is not typically an asset level consideration because it's all about how people run the business and run the system of that business. However, the environmental is very clearly related to some of the assets. The environmental impact of energy consumption or other factors is really quite clear in most tangible assets. So you'd expect that to be more prominent in that space. I think the reason that the majority are written at entity level is because the majority of investors look at the investment in this business as a whole rather than component parts. The majority of businesses look at the investment in the component parts, but the majority of investors have a different view. And I think that's where the standards are written from, or the proposed standards are written from. So I think it will probably percolate down to the individual asset class by virtue of the way the companies operate. But I'd be very interested to hear Becky's point of view on that.
Just sort of picking up on some of the things that both Richard and Rahul have said, I think it's an element of each of the sets of valuers learning from each other, because I think from the tangible asset side of things, both Richard and Rahul have alluded to this, we've developed quite a good framework for looking at those physical impacts. And you've got things like obviously flooding, energy performance, all of those sorts of things. So there's a reason why that E of ESG has been developed so much for tangible assets. I think from our point of view, governance isn't so much of a complication as social, which is exactly what Rahul said. And I think from our point of view, looking at the entity kind of guidance, from a tangible valuation point of view, that does have an impact when you're starting to think about the human aspect, as in occupiers, tenants, the kind of performance of occupants of a building. And we are starting to see some anecdotal evidence of that influencing some investment decisions, so who's in the building, as an operational entity, how do they conduct themselves in terms of ESG? But I think generally they've been handled quite separately. They're two quite separate forms of valuation. But my answer would be, I think we've got to learn from each other. And I think having one set across both sets of assets is very, very useful, and it needs to happen. I think, we probably need further development of that even more.
So we really need to understand which parts of the equation we're all doing in this complex world, and I guess the really important thing is that we get the answers to the clients, so that they can understand exactly the risks which are involved, and actually where those risks lie, and where they'll sit with the regulatory framework moving forward. I think that applies for all of us as well in terms of educating clients and just having those conversations. This is why we think anything that could potentially impact on value, whichever kind of valuation it is or whatever aspect of ESG it is, I think we need to be helping clients to understand why there's an impact, what the risks are, what the positives are. There's a big educational piece around this as well. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Becky. Can we go to the next polling question, which I think follows on from this? How relevant do you think the ESG factors are in the valuations today? Just a single choice if you can, please. And there's a second part to the question. How relevant do you think ESG factors will be in valuations in 5 years' time? So please, again, 30 seconds to respond to that question. Let's have a look. Polling question 3, the extremely relevant is only 12%, so probably a little bit of a shock there for me. Somewhat relevant 59, of little relevance 25, no relevance 4%. Wow, quite some interesting views and opinions there. But then there'll be a shift to becoming extremely relevant of 59% in 5 years' time, somewhat relevant and of little relevance 6%, and no relevance just the 1%. So perhaps going back to the question we were talking about earlier on about the urgency of this, 5 years is quite a big chunk into that 2050 weather forecast. So maybe we need to think about trying to accelerate some of the considerations further down. The blunt question I wanted to put to you is quite a challenge is, do you think the assumptions that valuers have relied on in the past regarding sustainability or ESG issues are reasonable today? Do you think that actually we've got a duty of care to not just the clients but to society in the information that we provide? And if so, how could we capture some of that transfer of information? Richard, any thoughts on that?
I'm really intrigued about this. We've already started to see some of this affect the corporate world in terms of people making a whole bunch of ESG related statements, which they either haven't a basis to make or they fail to implement, and being subject to either regulatory scrutiny or class action litigation around the propensity for them to embark upon greenwashing. So we've already seen this bubbling up in the world of corporates as opposed to valuation. So the key question is for us to understand the potential for impact on our valuations, because there is clearly in some industries a profound impact already, but to consider it in all cases. And in some cases that will mean that we'll make no adjustment to what we've historically done. And it will be very difficult to prove that wrong with the current level of detail that's in the market on some of these factors. There is insufficient comparability to line up valuations and say, well, you obviously got that wrong. Valuer A versus valuer Z. That's just not going to happen at the current level of maturity around disclosures. But what is going to happen is if you forget to think about the issue at all, and then subsequently someone says, well, that was obvious, you should have considered it, so why didn't you? I think that's the more clear and present risk for valuers of all designations at the minute. And I think it's incumbent upon us to take an appropriate degree of diligence to that duty of care, such that we cover off the big picture risks in our valuations with regard to ESG, even today, even while we haven't got perfect information. And that's the best foot that we can place forward at the moment.
Thanks, Richard. You've actually answered one of the questions there, which has come up on the chat function about risk and opportunities, and seeing some of the ESG factors in that space. Becky, do you think the assumptions that we have are relevant or proper at the moment?
I do. I mean, I think it's difficult. We've got to be careful. It's exactly what Richard said. We don't want to go kind of barreling ahead and start to say all sorts of things that we're not really qualified to say. But then at the same point, I don't think we can simply caveat this and the clients are going to be happy. You know, we can only talk about this so far, and we'll flag certain things. But, you know, if you need more help, we'll have to refer you to somebody else. I think that's traditionally how we would have dealt with some of these more technical issues. But I think with ESG and sustainability, there's going to be a big push to valuers in terms of upskilling and training and getting some more knowledge on this. We're not going to have to be experts. We can't do everything. But I think we do need to improve upon some of the detail that we can go into. I think the clients are going to expect that from us. I think just simply saying we can only comment so far is not going to be good enough in future. I think they're going to be looking to us to have, to be increasing our knowledge in these areas. I think and I think that's fair, you know, to a certain level.
And Rahul, just to come to you, but do you think that the courts will be looking for valuers to start to provide some of this information and within the due diligence which they might expect from professionals moving forward? But sorry to add that twist, Rahul. So over to you.
No, I think so. I absolutely, first of all, fully agree with Richard and Becky's comments on the assumptions. This world is, this space is dramatically evolving. I think let's not forget that there is the customers of a lot of these companies today are millennials and the Gen Zs who care a lot about sustainability. And that whole landscape has changed. The startup community is all over trying to figure out how to open this black box of sustainability and put metrics and measurement devices. As a consequence, there is more data available today than was available a while ago. And so then from an assumption perspective, absolutely, it's dynamic. We have to start thinking about what is available today and is going to be publicly disclosed and factor that in. But then to your point, yes. And therefore, as a consequence, we would be expected to have factored in some of this information that once we get to that point and companies are readily providing you these 6 metrics on E, S, and G, on culture, on board diversity, impact to climate, it'll be hard to argue that, hey, listen, I just used a broad brush on sustainability based on who the CEO is and did not get into the details, because some of these things, and I think it's a industry by industry analyses, as I think Richard pointed out too, where certain industries this will be meaningful, and I feel we want to be open, at least for the skeptics out there, we want to be open to studying what this data is telling us about growth and risk and the impact to valuation. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Rahul. Again, getting some great comments there. One or two questions. One in from Nick Brook. How does the panel recommend that IVSC address those ESG elements that don't lend themselves to be assessed from financial value perspective? So I guess these are the things that the economists would tend to call externalities, and that sort of pricing process, which is been a challenge in the market economies for a number of times. So again, perhaps Becky, any thoughts on that?
I think it's a difficult one for IVSC because you can't be too prescriptive when the market's not mature enough for that. But I appreciate that the question, you know, what can we do to start to help us to think about these things? And I think just sort of flagging key areas that we need to be thinking about. I know the RICS kind of started doing that in their sustainability paper on commercial valuation that was released last year. But I think it's drawing attention to the things that we need to be thinking about. I don't think we can be too prescriptive in what you have to do this, and this, but I think there could be some headlines or benchmarks or key areas that could be pointed out to valuers that we all need to be thinking about.
Thanks, Becky. Richard, anything from the BV perspective?
I think ultimately the ESG issues that will impact value will have a financial impact. It's just that the relationship is unclear as to how that financial impact will work. So that the ones that don't have a financial impact and never do have a financial impact will be, I think, of very little consequence to most investors now and into the future. The question as to how it might impact the way your customers behave towards you, so you're more or less likely to buy from you, how suppliers are willing to supply to you, and how governments are willing to let you operate. All those things are hugely relevant to value. And that's where ESG is really going to be looked at. It's what we need to untangle is, of course, how they link most directly to value. And I think that's where most of our thinking is going to be, rather than focusing on them as non-value oriented metrics.
Thanks, Richard. And Rahul, any thoughts from your vast experience in that new developing technology initiative areas that you've been
I for sure, I can't agree more with Richard. I think he said it a lot better than what I would have done here. But the reality is, I feel we've sort of had traditional ways of thinking about implications to cash flows, and that's sort of where our minds are etched. And yes, so folks understand what impacts cash flows. Well, fundamental analysis is based on that. But there are these other themes that I find emerging. And again, could be something as intangible as cultural issues and things going on, CEOs getting fired, auditors getting fired. And you ask the question, how does that translate to cash flows? But I feel over time, as the more you think about it, the more you get into the granular details. For example, like Richard alluded to, how customers, whether they buy a product or not. I have looked at a unicorn in the past where we sort of had issues, and we did some kind of an estimation of, okay, listen, if these are going to be the issues at the CEO level, this company is going to lose market share to its competitor over time. And what does that mean for a future EBITDA or a forecast? Right? You come up with a range of possibilities. Valuation is an art and not a science. Like, it's more art than science, I should say. So that's where you have at least developed a range of possible financial impacts from what feels like is intangible. And so I fully agree. I think we need to continue to think about these things as in the world of stakeholder capitalism, which is different from sort of where we were 10 years ago. I want to say a lot of these things will impact value, and you want to be open to sort of understanding and studying what that correlation is.
Yeah, thanks, Rahul. So it's scenario planning and testing statistically and following the market to see whether they coincide and whether they're moving apart. Yeah,
I think one quick thing I would add, and Richard again hit on this very early on in the conversation, is a role of rating providers. And I think we haven't had the chance to talk about it. But again, in a world where great data is not available just yet, we have intermediaries who are rating agencies who are coming up with ratings at very granular levels, and folks are using that. I would be careful and cautious and kick the tires every time you sort of get one of those. And talking to management and key investors is a great place to start there. So.
Great, thanks. Again, just before we go to the next polling question, the final polling question, there are a couple of fairly quick ones which perhaps the panel think about while we're taking the poll. One is, do you think it's appropriate to introduce a traffic light system for investments, which would just sort of give us a snapshot of red, amber, green to give information quickly and easily to clients? And the second one is, do you have any thoughts on how you might approach ESG criteria on fixed incomes, particularly sovereign bonds, for example? So again, looking where they're not going to flex in the marketplace. But Richard, if we can do the polling question, that would be great. Thank you. Which subset of ESGs do you think has the greatest bearing on valuation today? Environmental, social, or governance? And again, a 30-second response for that one, please, if we could. environmental get the biggest tick, social down at 9%, and governance in at 19%. So perhaps that reflects some of the comments from earlier on about social being more difficult to quantify than perhaps the others in monetary terms. But so certainly some more work to be done in that space. But again, I guess one of the questions is, do we think ESG, they're all equal? Are they all equally balanced? We tend to use them together, but maybe there is a different weighting that would be appropriate to apply. But any thoughts on traffic lights? Becky, sorry, you're sitting closest on that corner. So.
That's fine. Yeah, I do think traffic light systems are useful, particularly to valuers. You know, we're only able to go into a certain amount of detail. We don't have a lot of time and resource to necessarily drill down into some of the information that we're provided on these things. But again, it goes back to kind of what Richard said earlier on about being very careful, and Rahul just said it as well, very careful about, you know, how is that being measured? You know, what are the reds? What are the ambers? What are the greens? How are we making that decision? And again, it's who's making that decision. Where is that kind of coming from? And I think there needs to be a large amount of collaboration and consistency so that we're all doing the same thing if we're going to start using those kind of systems. But I have seen people start to sort of employ that kind of technique, because I think it is a useful snapshot for clients. But I would say it would probably be heavily caveated at the moment to say this is just a sample of reflection. It's not necessarily having an impact on numbers. You know, this is just for your information, sort of thing. So, yeah, I do think there's a place for them, but we've got to be quite careful. That's what I would say.
Yeah, thanks, Becky. And I guess it's always very easy as long as it's solid green or solid amber or solid red. It's when they get close to the margins when they start to become difficult. Rahul, any thoughts on that fixed income type process?
So I was thinking about it. My early reaction is there's a couple of places in a classic fixed income model where you're doing yield analysis, where in our process, we incorporate market spreads where we're looking for comparable bonds and sort of using that to inform. And then we have flexibility to make company specific adjustments. So given we are in a flux here, I'm not sure how much of this is actively getting priced in market spreads, but one should study that. Maybe it's partially captured there, where other companies, where comparable companies have ESG initiatives and are pricing it in. But to the extent the analysis reflects that that's not the case and your company is differentiated, you do have the flexibility, and we often use this, to use company specific adjustments to get to the appropriate yield to discount the cash flows. So I feel there is, hopefully I'm responding to the question asked, but that would be my 2 cents. Perfect.
Thank you, Rahul. Richard.
Yeah, I think the first question was too hard, so I'll go for the second one. We've already seen in the fixed income market in this country, we've got a lot of coal, as probably most people know. We've already seen the spreads on fixed interest obligations of coal producers spike considerably for 2 reasons. One is that the prospect of that business being adversely affected by the environmental changes in due course means that their cash flows are less stable and therefore of more risk to the credit markets. We've also seen an aversion by some classes of investors to actually holding that paper at all, and that's led to a kind of a liquidity premium that's crept into those prices as well. So we've already seen that at country levels. Ultimately, the governance issue factors very heavily on the prospects of the economy. But I think it's more about the prospects of the economy, and governance is a factor in terms of how you assess that. So I think they are being baked into some degree, but it's really where you've got exposure to some of the key risks that it has. And as we've seen with Russian paper, not too many people keen to hold Russian paper in this part of the world, or the part of the world that's on the phone call. And I think we've certainly seen that sort of stuff creep into that market as well. But it's not a formulaic approach. It's where the risks make a material difference to the the willingness to hold the paper or the risks involved in doing so.
Thanks again. Really great response to the questions there. We're nearly out of time, but just to close with very quick fire around the three experts. If you got one wish for something to happen really quickly, what would it be in no more than 3-4 words? Becky.
I'd say I'd like 3 or 4 consistent metrics. That's it that we could report to.
Great. Rahul?
A global standard. There are many standards out there, but there may be one amongst those to sort of at least give some guidance to companies.
Thanks, Rahul. And Richard?
I think Becky said it best. Clear and consistent metrics, but not too many.
Fantastic. That's really great. I really enjoyed this hour. It's flown past. There's a request for the slides to be made available. I'm sure that's okay, but I'll talk to Alex afterwards. Thank you, everybody, for joining. It's been really great to host this.